And Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and a good afternoon, and welcome to the Voice of the Cape's online Matric Revision program, conducted in collaboration with Futures Academy, Essays Online High School. And today we have Danielle Pretorius back with us. However, the subject is different. It is history, and the content in this particular session will be on paper one of the history examination. And I know for many grade 12s now it is the holiday period, but definitely it's the best time now to also get that information in terms of preparation. So the session will help you gain insight into what to expect in paper one of the history paper. So I'll hand over to you, Danielle, to proceed with the lesson.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So let me just share my resources and then we can proceed. So, hi everyone. In our first class on the history, we were chatting about the examination guidelines and examination skills. And then what we'll be looking at today is the paper one content, going through the paper one, and then applying the history skills to the paper one and the content that you will find in that paper. So, what I'd like to start with is just to quickly rehash what is going to be covered in your paper one. So, I'm using the examination guidelines from the Department of Basic Education. This is where for all your subjects will have examination guidelines, and this is where you will find the scopes for the NSC. So, for the paper one, the topics you covered in term 1 and 2 are applicable. So the Cold War, the origins of the Cold War as your source-based question, and your essay question is on Vietnam. Then independent Africa, on the source-based side, we have Africa in the Cold War, case study Angola. And then on your essay question side, we have case study the Congo, how was independence realized in Africa in the 1960s and 70s. Lastly, you have the civil society protests from 1950s to 1970s. This is the America one. Note that the South African civil protests is for your paper 2. So this here, civil resistance, South Africa. But the civil society protests is the American section of the work. So for your source-based, you have the focus of the US civil rights movement. And then for your essay question, you have Black Power movement. So important to note again that how you answer your history paper is you get a section A and you get a section B. Section A is your source-based questions. There are 3. You answer at least 1. Section B has 3 essay questions. You answer at least 1. And then you need to answer a third question that could be either a source-based question or could be an essay question. So that means you need to pick 3 topics from the 6 to study. Because history is a very subject or content intensive subject, I would recommend to choose topics to focus on and study like that rather than studying all of them and then deciding, so that you rather know topics that you know you're going to do in depth rather than just knowing all of them kind of generally and then just hoping for the best in the exam. So I think what's nice to note here is that these the Cold War, origins of the Cold War, extension of the Cold War, case study Vietnam, they're grouped together. This is topic 1, this is topic 2, this is topic 3. So when you're choosing, remember you need to do 1 source-based, 1 essay, and 1 can be either source-based or an essay. I would recommend to choose 2 from the same topic because they go together, so the work flows kind of nicely, and then a third option. For your third option, which can be either source-based or an essay, I said this before in the first class, but I recommend that students do another source-based question just because I find that generally students struggle with the essay questions more. Also, with the source-based questions, you have a set of questions that count a specific amount of marks and you have to answer those. If you happen to not answer one correctly, we mark it incorrect and we move to the next question. With the essay question, it's one big question. So if you mess up with your essay question, it's a lot more risk than a source-based question. So that's why I also just recommend to do a source-based. Also, in terms of time, essays tend to take much longer for students than source-based. So mainly for that reason, I recommend that you do two source-based and one essay. But it's completely up to you and how you feel you will score best. So if you note that you score higher in essay questions, maybe you should answer two essay questions. If you note that you score higher in the source-based questions, maybe rather answer two source-based questions and one essay question. So kind of tailor it to your academic needs and how the work fits in for you. So if you really enjoyed the Cold War section, focus on that. If you didn't enjoy the Independent Africa section or the US Civil Rights Movement section, then leave that. So what I want to do today is I'm going to use some of this first topic, but mostly from the third topic, the U.S. Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement, to illustrate how you will approach doing the paper one. So I think the first thing we should do is to take a look at a past paper so that you can see how these question focus points translate into an actual question. So important to note, this question focus, the stages in the war, that is not going to be the question that's your essay question is not going to be the stages of the war. It's just the question focus. So if we look at an example here, so here, question one, the Cold War, origins of the Cold War, that aligns to the question focus here. These are the things you have to know underneath. And then the question, actual question, focuses on one specific bit. So how did the Truman Doctrine contribute to Cold War tensions between the USA and the USSR from 1947? So keyword, Truman Doctrine. If you go here, you will see one of the things discussed is the Truman Doctrine. So the question focus is the origins of the Cold War, but it could be any of these things as the actual question. That's just the general kind of focus area or part that they're looking at, the origins of the Cold War. Similarly, for the essay questions, because I think what often happens is students see the stages in the war, then they prep and memorize an essay about the stages in the war. What that means, though, is that when you get to your exam, you are not very flexible with changing your essay or coming up with new things because you've already memorized it in that way. And you'll see here, it is extension of the Cold War, case study Vietnam, but it's not asking you about the stages in the war specifically. You will use the stages in the war to answer this question, but this is a very common one that they like to ask, and it's on the warfare tactics used. So you will follow the structure of discussing this, because this is the chronological order of things. But when you're doing that, you need to talk about the warfare strategies employed rather than just generally the phases of the war. So in that way, it's important that you don't if you do choose to prepare an essay beforehand, that you are open to changing it and open to making it flexible. Because if you're not, you don't answer the essay question. So while it is on Vietnam, it's asking you a specific question. And if you don't answer the specific question, then you will lose marks in how the essay is marked. We'll take a look at that just now as well in terms of one of these essays. So we'll see here that we have our source-based question for Cold War, on Truman Doctrine, on Angola. Here we have how did the statistics create debates and controversies about the outcome of the Battle of Cuito Cuanavale. And then here for US civil rights, what were the challenges encountered by the civil rights protesters who participated in the Selma to Montgomery marches in March 1965? So if you go here, you will see Freedom Summer and the Selma Montgomery marches. And then the essay questions, we have one on Vietnam, which is on the warfare strategies. On independent Africa, the Congo, it's on Mobutu Sese Seko's reforms. And for the Black Power movement, it's about the extent to which various role players were successful in using the Black Power philosophy to end discrimination against African Americans in the United States of America. So various role players is in Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, and then the Black Panther Party, to how each of them contributed to ending discrimination as part of the Black Power movement. So what I want to look at first is the section A, which is your source-based questions. And how I want to approach this work is I'm going to pull up a set of summaries for the question. But what we're really trying to do here is to more look at how you extract information from the sources as well, and how you combine that with your knowledge that you've been studying. Because oftentimes I think students struggle to translate the content that they've studied to answering questions in the source base, particularly because they want you to refer to the sources. Similarly, there's the same issue arises with the essay question, where students don't know how to synthesize an argument or synthesize the facts to come up with an argument. So we'll look at how we do that for some particular questions as well. Okay, so the first thing that I want you to note is, so let's start with question 3, which is on the US Civil Rights Movement. So looking at the reasons and origins for the Civil Rights Movement, the role, impact, and influence of Martin Luther King Jr., the forms of protest, you have to know these protests, school desegregation, case study Little Rock, Arkansas, and then the short and long-term gains. Okay, so specifically here in this question, this is last year's NSC exam. They ask, what were the challenges encountered by the civil rights protesters who participated in the Selma to Montgomery marches in March 1965? So applying some of the knowledge from the first class, we know that this question is also going to be your paragraph question. So when you're reading through the sources, look for information on this that you can include in your paragraph, because as we said in the last class, that for your paragraph question, which is at the end of each source-based question, it counts 8 marks. Students use their own knowledge. You're not supposed to use your own knowledge. You're supposed to use it sparingly. The majority of the information that you will use for that paragraph comes from the sources. So employing the tactics we practiced or learned about in the first class, we read the context of the source. It's going to tell us what it is about, when it was written, all of those types of things. So this source below outlines the reasons for the first Selma to Montgomery march in the USA on 7 March 1965. It also highlights why it was referred to as Bloody Sunday. Okay, so on 2 January 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Dallas County Voters League, and other local African American activists in a voting rights campaign in Selma, where, in spite of repeated registration attempts by local Black people, only 2% were on the voters' roll. The SCLC had chosen to focus its efforts in Selma because they anticipated that the notorious brutality of local law enforcement under Sheriff Jim Clark would attract national attention and pressure President Lyndon B. Johnson and Congress to enact new national voting rights legislation. In response to Jackson's death, the civil rights activist, activists in Selma and Marion set out on 7 March to march from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery. While King was in Atlanta, his SCLC colleague, Hosea Williams, and SCNC leader John Lewis led the march. The marchers made their way through Selma across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where they faced a blockade of state troopers and local lawmen commanded by Clark and Major Cloud, who ordered the marchers to disperse. When they did not, Cloud ordered his men to advance. Cheered on by white onlookers, the troopers attacked the crowd with clubs and tear gas. Mounted police chased retreating marchers and continued to beat them. Television coverage of Bloody Sunday, as the event became known, triggered national outrage. And then it's from here, website.com, a story about just the march. Okay, so I'm not going to do this for all the sources because it takes time for me to read it out loud, but we'll do some of them so you can see how you would apply it. So one of the biggest things to note is coming from our last class is when we were chatting about mark allocation. So 3 times 1, 1 times 2, all of these that have a 3 times 1 or 1 times 2, where it's times with 1 generally, here on the 1 or times 2. When we get here higher level questions, it means you need to give higher order responses. It's usually indicated by the 2 times 2 equals 4. When it's like this, where it says 3 organizations and list, you don't need to give a whole paragraph. You just have to list the 3 organizations. So a lot of times with your lower order questions, it is just comprehension. You need to go find the answer from the source. So you will see here that it says extraction of information. So if you see 2 times 1, or in this case, it was 3 times 1, so you extract the information from the source. You will also see then that in the memo, it explains what type of question it is, what the students had to do to answer that question. So you will see it says here, extraction of evidence. So here, you literally take the evidence as it is right from the source. So it says 3 organizations that participated in the voting rights campaign. So here it says on Sunday, Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, so SCLC, there's one, SNCC, there's another one, and Dallas County Voters League. So the thing here that some students would fall in the trap of is saying Martin Luther King Jr. But Martin Luther King Jr. is not an organization. It says 3 organizations in the source. At that time, he was part of the SCLC. Okay, so these are your 3, and you write them down straight as they appear here in the source. So define the term voting rights campaign in your own words. So this is where you would use the knowledge that you've studied to answer questions like this. Similarly, where it says here, why do you think only 2% of local Blacks appeared on the voters' roll in Selma? This answer comes here. So it says, so the SCLC had chosen to focus in its efforts in Selma because of the brutality. And here it says that in spite of repeated registration attempts, only 2% won the voters' roll. So in this context, they tell us that this area, Selma, is very well known for kind of white supremacy, police brutality, violence. So in this question, why do you think only 2% of local Black people appeared on the voters' roll in Selma? It's because in spite of repeated registration attempts, it's because they were intimidated when they tried to register, turned away, or in some way or form demotivated from registration. So because of the violence they faced and because of the intimidation and risk, only 2% of local Black people were on the voters' roll. So again, name 2 leaders that led the march, comprehension, and then here, using the information in the source and your own knowledge, explain how demonstrators benefited from the media coverage of the Bloody Sunday incident. So here it says television coverage of Bloody Sunday as the event became known started national outrage, anger. So that would be the one thing that you could say here. But you need to also use your own knowledge. So when we look at the memo then, so brutality was widely exposed to the civil rights activists. It helped identify the oppressors and the oppressed. It led to national and international embarrassment to the pro-democratic country. It validated the demands of the demonstrators. This led to the passing of the Voting Rights Act. It led to national and international sympathy in supporting the demands of the demonstrators. Any other relevant response? So you take this last line that we had in the source, and then you consolidate that with your own knowledge. So you would have learned about Bloody Sunday towards the more of the end of um, the civil rights movement. So generally, with the civil rights movement section, um, it's important to just know your forms of disobedience. So they list them here in the examination guidelines as well. So here, Montgomery bus boycotts, sit-ins, freedom riders, campaigns and marches, Birmingham campaign, March to Lincoln Memorial, Freedom Summer, Selma Montgomery marches. So this is work that you learned about. And you will see here, so Selma Montgomery marches, the result, the new president protected the marches and went on national television to pledge his support. They were welcomed by a crowd of 50,000 people. The march was successful in that Lyndon Johnson passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which guaranteed the right to vote for all African Americans. Okay, so you consolidate the information in the source with your own knowledge to give answers like that. When it comes to more higher order level questions, so let's take this question. So use sources 3A and 3B. Explain if the evidence in source 3A supports the information in source 3B regarding how the state troopers dealt with the demonstrators at the Selma to Montgomery March on 7 March 1965. Note the mark allocation here as well. It's 2 times 2 equals 4. So you need to give 2 complex responses for 2 marks to get the 4 marks. So illustrated here, 2 times 2 equals 4. Write 2 complex responses. This is when they want you to do an interpretation or an explanation. So let's look at what we covered last week, or rather in our first class, on how we do comparison of sources. So in a comparison of sources, you are expected to gather information from both sources which correspond or differ to each other. For example, you will say source A says this and source B confirms this by saying. So you get 1 mark for one comparison. You don't get a mark for what source A says and then what source B says. So important to note, you need to give 2 comparisons. So let's look at source 3A, which we read, and then let's look at source 3B. So source A was about the reasons for the Selma to Montgomery March. And then source B is an extract from John Lewis's, chairperson of the SNCC's, testimony in a federal hearing within a week after the Bloody Sunday incident. It gives an account of how the first march was stopped and the demonstrators were ordered to disperse. So immediately, I can already realize here, so it says it also highlights why it was referred to as Bloody Sunday. And then here it says, the marchers made their way through Selma across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where they faced a blockade of state troopers and local lawmen, commanded by Clark and Major John Cloud, who ordered the marchers to disperse. So there's already a similarity in them ordering them to disperse. So important to note with this one as well, if we were to be looking at reliability of the source, it is an extract from John Lewis, who's a key figure in the Selma to Montgomery marches. It's an extract from his testimony, which means this is word for word what he said. So that makes it quite reliable as well. Also, look who made the article or who published the article. It's from the National Archives of the Record of District Courts of the United States. So this is very reliable as well because it's the government's extracts or transcripts that they keep of the court hearing. So Attorney Hall, then what happened? John Lewis, he said, I am Major Cloud, and this is an unlawful assembly. This demonstration will not continue. You have been banned by the governor. I am going to order you to disperse. Mr. Williams, an SCLC activist, said, "Mr. Major, I would like to have a word. Can we have a word?" And he said, "No, I will give you 2 minutes to leave." And again, Mr. Williams said, "Can I have a word?" He said, "There will be no word." And in about a minute or more, Major Clark ordered the state troopers to advance, and at that time, the state troopers took their position, I guess, and they moved forward with their clubs up over their near their shoulders, the top part of their body. They came knocking us down and pushing us. So here we read about the clubs again that we read about here as well. So cheered on by white onlookers, the troops attacked the crowds with clubs and tear gas. I will highlight that in blue. So was any word said by the state troopers? Well, the state troopers, most of them kept saying, move back, disperse, and things like that. Attorney Hall. After you were stopped at some subsequent time, was tear gas used by the state troopers or some form of gas? John Lewis. Well, when we were forced back, most of the people in line knelt in a prayerful manner. They had their backs towards the Selma, kneeling, the line all the way back was almost a spontaneous reaction on the part of all the people in the line as far back as you could see. And that time, the major ordered the state troopers to put on their gas masks, and they started throwing gas, and people became sick and started vomiting. And some of us were forced off the highway and behind some buildings in the woods. Okay, so we need to here, let's look at what the question is telling us again. So how they dealt with the demonstrators. So here they say that they took up clubs and used them against the protesters. Here in this source, they also say the troopers attacked the crowds with clubs. Here they speak about tear gas. Here they also speak about tear gas. Here they speak about how many of them were forced off the highway and behind some buildings in the woods. Here it says mounted police chased retreating marchers and continued to beat them. So they started dispersing. So we will see that reflected in the memo then. Remember, you need to give two comparisons. You can't just give what the source A says and then what the source B says and then a mark for each of that. You need to compare them. So you will see here. So both sources show that Major Cloud ordered the state troopers to disperse the crowd. The SCLC leadership or the SCLC leaders in source 3A state that peaceful civil rights movement activists always awaited brutal attacks from the racist police. And in source 3B, they explain how the police were instructed to attack the peaceful unarmed protesters. In source 3A, it is explained how the police were instructed to use clubs. And in source B, John Lewis testifies how the protesters were affected by the gas. In source 3A, it is stated that mounted police were used to disperse the protesters. And in source 3B, John Lewis testifies that some of the protesters were forced off the highway and ran into the woods. Any other relevant response? Okay, so do you see how they give what source A gave and then how it is supported by what source B says? So in source A, they explain this, and in source B, he testifies how they were affected by the gas. Okay, so you need to give two responses to get your 4 marks for this one. So pay attention with your higher order questions, because if you didn't know how to answer a comparison question, you wouldn't be able to get those marks. And these types of skills are applicable across questions. So it's important that you know how to do those. And then the one thing I want to touch on before we move on to the essay question is, okay, let's just do this one as well. Comment on the usefulness of the source, just because it's another one of these higher order questions. So here in the addendum, source 3C. So it says the extract is from a writing by Martin Luther King, published in the book of A Testament of Hope, the essential writings and speeches of Martin Luther King Jr. It provides a reflection on Martin Luther King's preparation for the second Selma to Montgomery March. So already there's my first reason. So the difference between a usefulness question and a reliability question. A reliability question asks, can we rely on this information? A usefulness question is, can we use this information? So it says, a usefulness for a historian researching the preparations for the second Selma to Montgomery March. So the source is about Martin Luther King's preparations for the second Selma to Montgomery March. So yes, we would say the source is useful. And then look at the mark allocation. We need to give 2 reasons as to why it's useful. Firstly, it is an extract from a writing by Martin Luther King, which gives his reflections on his preparations for the second Selma to Montgomery March. He was a key leader in the Selma to Montgomery March, hence his reflection would be useful. So before even reading the source, we got this from the context that they lay out here. So the context that they provide at the beginning of the sources are quite helpful. So you will see then in the memo, before we move on to the paragraph question and then the essay question. So this source is useful because it is an extract from a piece of writing by Martin Luther King. He penned his writings as the leader of the civil rights movement. The writing was during the course of the Selma to Montgomery marches. It provides an outline of planning and preparations for the second Selma to Montgomery march. Okay, so we got these 2. It's an extract from a piece of writing by Martin Luther King Jr. He was a leader of the Selma to Montgomery march. And it gives an outline of his planning and preparations. So in terms of your paragraph question, so remember how I said that with your paragraph question, you would use the information in the sources to answer the questions. So let me just pull up the memo again. I closed it for some reason. There we go. So your paragraph question will always be the same as this question. So what were the challenges encountered by the civil rights protesters who participated in the Selma to Montgomery marches? So here, using the information in the relevant sources and your own knowledge, write a paragraph of about 8 lines explaining the challenges that were encountered by civil rights protesters. So note that it says of about 8 lines, so about 80 words. Because this is not a language subject like Afrikaans and English, they don't really care about the word count. When I used to do history, I used to write like 100, 120 words, and it was always accepted and marked. So do not feel limited by the amount of words if you feel like you could have said more. What you should do in the paragraph question is be very specific so that you don't waste words. And it also cannot just be 1 or 2 sentences. Okay. So it says information in the relevant sources. So do you see how you would be able to get information from the sources? Because the sources are all about the main question, what were the challenges? And your paragraph question is on the same question, what were the challenges? So to answer your paragraph question, you will read through the sources. And while you're reading through the sources, just go, where do I see challenges? Where do I see challenges? And go and highlight those. So after you have a good couple of facts, I would say like, let's say 5 or 6, note that it's not like you need to have 8 facts for the 8 marks. For your essay question, it's marked holistically. So that means that you also need to write in a paragraph and show like writing skills to get the marks. It's not just facts. So you will see how the memo does it. It literally gives the where the information came from, out of which source as well. And then we'll look at the table of how they mark it. So it says here, candidates could include the following aspects. So you didn't have to include all of them. So civil rights protesters in the Selma to Montgomery march were demonstrating for voting rights. That's your own knowledge. African Americans were excluded from voter registration in Selma, source 3A. Only 2% in Selma were on the voters' roll, source 3A. The marchers faced police brutality during the protest, source 3A. They were faced with a blockade of police in order to disperse. the white supremacists cheered the police using violence against African Americans. Marchers were attacked with clubs, tear gas, beaten and chased. The police used derogatory language and hurled insults at the nonviolent protesters. They were knocked down and pushed by state troopers. Major Cloud refused to listen to the protesters. Protesters were attacked even when they were kneeling. So all of this just came from the two sources that we read, and there was even more that you could say. So do you see how you use your own knowledge so sparingly? You didn't even have to use your own knowledge. Use the information in the sources. What you need to make sure then, though, is that you extract the relevant information in the sources. So how you do that, as I said, is you read through it and you just constantly ask yourself, is this a challenge they faced? Is this a challenge they faced? And then you put them together. It's not that you have to say, like you could also just give it like this. It just has to be in a paragraph. You cannot bullet point your responses. So you will see here is the how it's marked. So uses evidence in an elementary manner, shows no or little understanding of the challenges that were encountered, uses evidence partially or cannot write a paragraph. If you write in bullet points, if you write one sentence, you cannot write a paragraph. If you write multiple paragraphs, you automatically score in level 1 because you couldn't fulfill your presentation section. So similarly to how your essay question is marked on presentation and then on content, your paragraph question is not just reliant on your content, but also on your presentation, which is the second bullet point. Level 2 uses evidence in a very basic manner to write a paragraph. Level 3 uses evidence very effectively in an organized paragraph. Okay, so that's going to be how you score those higher marks in your paragraph question. Take the information out of the sources. So what I want to focus on now for the last 15 minutes is how you would approach an essay question. So note that with the civil rights movement one, the Black Power movement is separate from the civil rights movement. So many times, especially like even still in the prelims, what students do is they conflate the Black Power movement with the civil rights movement. So then in their Black Power movement, they talk about the sit-ins and the freedom rides and Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. But that is completely separate from the Black Power movement. They're like polar opposites. So when you mix those two together, it shows a real lack of understanding, and that's going to very negatively affect your essay mark. So pay in mind, the Black Power movement and the Civil Rights movement were two separate movements that just built off of each other. So we first had the Civil Rights movement, and then we had the Black Power movement. So here, the essay question is asking, explain to what extent various role players were successful in using the Black Power philosophy to end discrimination against African Americans in the United States of America in the 1960s. Okay, so don't talk about the civil rights movement. So while we're busy with the essay questions, I just want to show some other possible ones that they could do within the same question focus. So here it says, explain to what extent the philosophy of Black Power empowered African Americans to be assertive and do things for themselves during the 1960s. So how did they promote or did they create inspiration and self-reliance? Where here they asked how it was to end discrimination. Then in the 2020 paper, never mind, they swapped them around here. Yeah, so this civil society protest we have on the inspire and being self-reliant, which is one of the things that popped up in your notes. And then for this one, they're just asking you to talk about the role players. So when you see this various role players, it means you need to touch on the figures of the Black Power movement. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up the memo, and then also I made an outline of an example that we can go through. So you will see how you take the information in the content and convert it to an essay question or to an essay. So let's take here Black Power movement, and then the example essay question. Okay, so this one here is actually, I did the 2021 one, which I'll just use as an example for now, and then we'll switch to the 2022 one. But so what I did, the first thing is I underlined or highlight, if you're in your paper, what they want me to talk about. So remember in our first class, we also looked at different types of essay questions and what you need to do. So here we have an explain to what extent. So explain to what extent you need to state the degree to which something is or believed to be the case. This type of question calls for a thorough assessment of evidence. So you need to use a lot of evidence. So how the philosophy of Black power empowered African Americans to be assertive and do things for themselves during the 1960s. So remember, really important, your introduction should be a direct response to the question. You are expected to take a stance, explain it, and then outline the main content or evidence that you will use to support your stance. So what that means with an explain to what extent, you need to say that, did the philosophy of Black power inspire African Americans to be assertive and do things for themselves, or did it not? So I start with a little introduction. The Black Power movement emerged in the later half of the 1960s, fueled by the dissatisfaction with the socio-economic conditions and the lack of achievement in making real progress in the civil rights movement. The philosophy of Black power empowered African Americans to be assertive and do things for themselves during the 1960s. So that's my direct response to the question. I state that I am agreeing to the question. Then I state how I'm going to talk about it. So this is evident through the promotion of Black power ideologies that called for Black solidarity, as well as the Black Panther Party's efforts. So I'm going to look at the Black power ideologies that called for Black solidarity, and then Black Panther Party's efforts. Then in our body, so you structure it as like your content or your evidence to link and support the stance that you took in the introduction. So you look at evidence that will support your stance that the philosophy of Black power empowered African Americans. So you lie down some context first, because otherwise it's kind of difficult to understand. So your context should be quite brief, and it would be the situation in the USA before the 1960s. So there was a lack of political organization for African Americans, and there was a lack of a sense of pride. There was a lack of strong cultural identity. So here, this is what you would also want to speak about. So even though Martin Luther King Jr. had waged a successful campaign against Jim Crow laws in the South, a growing number of younger activists began to feel that nonviolent tactics could not right every social and political injustice. And out of that context, the Black Power movement emerged. So, although the civil rights movement of the 1950s and early 60s achieved legislative change, so like the Voting Rights Act, and the passing of other couple of laws, so legislative as in laws, and it particularly focused on the discriminative Jim Crow laws in the southern states. So particularly in the South, although that happened, Black people in the North still lived in slum areas, were poor, and lacked access to civil services. African Americans were still economically and politically crippled in the USA due to discriminatory laws. There was a lack of a sense of pride due to social economic circumstances. They lived in the ghettos and slum areas. And African Americans also became impatient with the slow pace of change and the impact of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And they were also subjected to police brutality, which led to the growth of nationalist feelings, spurring on the Black Power movement. Then, the next thing we would talk about is the philosophy of the Black Power movement. So you would speak about these things here. So they believed in the concepts of self-pride and self-esteem, self-respect. the principles of Black power against racial oppression and manipulation. And then you would touch on Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael as the main kind of pushers of the Black Power movement. So here you would highlight that he promoted African clothing, African hairstyles, promoted the slogan "Black is beautiful," advocated for the principles of Black power, to do things for yourself, self-reliance, take pride in their own culture. And then you would chat about the Black Panther Party as well, and how their 10-point plan also created self-reliance, because their whole thing was to have solidarity in Black communities and uplift their own Black communities. So here they got involved in street patrols. They also had like education systems and like health centers that they created. They had a free breakfast for children program, those types of things which encourage solidarity within the Black community. So you would touch on that. And every time you do that and you bring in a new idea, you need to say how it furthers your argument of they did do this. So say, for example, we talk about the Black Power movement in terms of the Black Panther Party, then we would say, we would explain for maybe their 10-point plan, and then also how they created health centers, provided free breakfast for children program, provided tutoring programs for Black learners in schools, and how this empowered African Americans to be self-reliant, create a sense of solidarity in their communities. How when you were talking about Malcolm X or Stokely Carmichael, how his ideas also empowered African Americans to be assertive and do things for themselves. So just linking it back in each paragraph to your essay question. And then at the end, for your conclusion, you briefly summarize what you spoke about and you give a closing statement. It's also generally quite nice, and that scores you usually higher marks, is linking it to the real world or to contemporary history. So, for example, with the Black Power movement, as you've worked through the content for the Black Power movement, I hope that you've noticed perhaps some similarities between the Me Too movement and the Black Power movement, in that the Black Power movement symbol is the fist, the clenched fist. And it's the same thing for the Me Too movement. So the Me Too movement bases its roots on the Black Power movement. So in your conclusion, to draw an independent conclusion and kind of bring it into the real world, you could also say that the effects of the Black Power movement are still felt today, for example, or as illustrated in the philosophies used in the Black Lives Matter movement. Okay, sorry, not the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. I apologize. So essentially, what you need to do is you need to incorporate the evidence or the content here, but then focus it to your argument. So you use your content as evidence to support the argument that you're stringing along. So you make your statement, then you use the evidence to support your statement. Then you make another statement, then you use the evidence to support your statement. So if we look at the memo then for the this question where they ask you to chat about the role players, to conclude. So you'll see here, again, almost all of these, they start with conditions in the USA. So they give background, then what the Black Power movement did. Then, like I said, because they want you to speak about the role players. So that would be Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, Black Panther Party. Then you start talking about Malcolm X. You speak about Stokely Carmichael. You speak about the Black Panther Party and those short and long-term gains. So you will see that the stuff here that they spoke about is exactly what's also here. So reasons for the Black Power movement, formation of the Black Panther Party, roles of Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, Huey Newton, and other African-American activists, short and long-term gains. So it's about how you string the information together to support your argument. So you study the content as evidence, and then you practice doing essay questions like this while referring back to the memo so that you can see how you should structure your argument. Because oftentimes, I think students fall in the trap of just regurgitating evidence and not having an argument in your history essay. And that's really what they want you to do. So here is the marking matrix for how all your essays are marked. This is the same for all NSC papers. So you will see here that you are marked on presentation and on content. What this means is if your presentation mark is not good, your content mark automatically cannot be good either. So it's important that you have an introduction, you have an argument, and you have a conclusion to score high on the presentation. And then the content is just you actually giving the content you've been studying. But as you can see, your essay is a combination of the argument you're making and how you present it and the content you're using. So you need to consider both of those when you're constructing your essay. Cool. So that's it from me for today. I believe next week we will continue and we'll look at the paper 2 specifically. So that is looking at the crisis of apartheid in the 1980s, Black consciousness, which links quite nicely to Black power. Note they're different. And then the TRC and the negotiated settlement and the government of national unity. And then your end of the Cold War topic, globalization, and the impact of Gorbachev's reforms. Cool. Thank you.
Wonderful, Danielle. Thank you for a very informative session. Once again, we look forward to having you back next week. Take care, and to all the viewers who has tuned in, all the best, especially to our grade 12 preparing for the examinations ahead. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and good afternoon to you.
Awesome. Thank you.